of the conference is communication policy and strategy. So whenever we talk about communication, whenever we discuss communication, actually communication should be understood as the final stage of fostering those who are involved in communication. And we also have to think about the instrument, the tool which is used in communication, that is language. Generally speaking, we have to think about the competence of those who are involved in communication, therefore language users' competence. And this is what I'm gonna present in my lecture, talking about language and culture. As you know, language, this is somehow directed, my discussion is directed towards linguistic competence, while culture, well, I'm just telling you in advance, it's gonna be just a few words on culture, and I'll try to explain the notion of culture, etc. Especially that the title is the language and culture interconnection, and this relationship, this connection, especially the relationship, is clearly demonstrated in the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is often criticized. Anyway, if we analyze it in detail, if we look at it from some different perspective, we can see how helpful it can be, well, just discussing this problem, the language culture interconnection. So let me somehow now pass to the discussion, and I've got to say that in the course of the discussion, I'm just using some quotations from the literature, and I tried to put the stress, well, nomen omen, as I said, on the interconnection between language and culture, and language and culture viewed as a key components determining successful language usage, in this case in communication, and also successful language studies, since I mentioned, you know, that most of us, as I understand, are involved in teaching foreign languages to students. Finally, I tried somehow to put my attention on the role of creativity and expressiveness. If communication, you are successful if you are expressive. So, and coming back to what I started with, namely with competence, well, I tried to develop an image, a view known just or presented to you as creative communicative competence. So, well, just this is in brief what can be found in my presentation. And now let me come to the very text of it. Well, so let us start with language and culture at work. Well, we know that the modern world, especially now on the brink of the 21st century, is governed and guided by human communication. So people representing different nations, different professions, organize fora, panels, or conferences like this one in order to negotiate, well, different issues. And for such debates, the conditio sine qua non is the adoption of internationally recognized means of communication. Well, as we know, in the civilized world of the Middle Ages, the role of international language was played by Latin. Nowadays, the same role has been assigned to English, and this is the evidence anyway. Whenever we talk about any international means of communication, this is the evidence that at any stage of human development and activity, there has always been a need for communication, and therefore the employment of commonly accepted linguistic instrument responsible for inevitable human contacts. So let us think, what is responsible for the effective use of language? To use language effectively, it is inevitable first to construct and then to employ the whole system, which is responsible for expressiveness of the language user. And this is just one of those main issues I'm gonna discuss later on. So I use the term system, which automatically indicates that there must be more than one element as a component part. So just I somehow disclosed at the very beginning that it's the one of those elements must be language. Now, apart from the language in its traditional means or perception as a means of communication, so there must be one more element of the system. And it is quite reasonable that, as you may expect, this element must be culture, and especially the language user's cultural competence, which combined with linguistic competence is responsible for expressiveness and for success in communication. So this sketchy account can be presented graphically. Of course, so I'm not going to draw anything on the wall or whatever. Anyway, if we can imagine a triangle, so I'll try to build graphically the a sort of the communication triangle, where its three legs are grammar, culture, expressiveness. So this is what the communication triangle is supposed to be. Well, at first glance, if you can imagine it, the components parts of the communication triangle may seem arguable unless they are made plain and thus comprehensive. So, well, in the course of my presentation, I tried somehow to explain what they stand for and what is what roles they play. Well, grammar. Grammar, in this case, is understood traditionally as the branch of linguistics which deals with syntax and morphology, and in consequence is a system of rules which make language work. Hence, grammar is viewed as the study of how words and their component parts combine to form sentences and finally make the language expressive, or actually the language user expressive. Instead, well, anyway, grammar as an element of the discussed here triangle, we may frankly say, stands for language, only denoting its core element. So whenever reference to grammar is given, it denotes language in its panoramic image, which comprises, according to von Humboldt's terminology, language as a process, energeia, and language as a product, ergon. Nevertheless, it is necessary to underscore that language has to be viewed as a system of graphic, signs, and vocalic signals, which are used in the course of communication to pass on information, exchange views, or demonstrate moods and feelings. So the language signs, signals, or symbols are utilized in the process of communication and become a conventional code acquired and known to language users who represent a given language community and are distinguished from another community by rituals, social norms, manners, or behavior. In this way, language symbolizes cultural reality. This is cultural reality and testifies to the identity of those individuals who compose a culturally distinguished community. This standpoint is also supported by Gramsci, who says, and here comes a quote, "Language is not culture-free code distinct from the way people think and behave, but rather it plays a major role in the perpetuation of culture." So, even a rough analysis of the above quoted opinion makes us realize that the idea of linguistic determinism, as one once presented by Benjamin Wolfe, is quite realistic. That's why, I decided somehow to return to that the original version and present it in a somewhat different way. Now, we must not forget that communities may differ with reference to the way of thinking and the mental characteristics of a given group of people in general. Generally speaking, we differ. And well, actually, it was a lengthy discussion in the morning during the presentation of the Professor M from Spain. And well, there was something. He was talking about some different issues, but actually, some linguistic or cultural differences are really important whenever we talk about European Union as a unity in diversity, as some people say. Anyway, so, well, in this respect, as you can see, the somewhat controversial and criticized Sapir-Whorf hypothesis gains momentum. The Sapir, well, we know that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as we actually know it today, can be broken into basic principles: linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. And later on, I'm just going to show how these issues work within the triangle. So, anyway, it is linguistic determinism which puts a stress on the interconnection and interrelationship between language as a code and culture as its background. The hypothesis refers to the beliefs that the language we use to some extent determines the way in which we view and think about the world around us. The concept emphasizes the relationship between language and thinking as an immanent act of mind, characteristic of people representing a social group. Nevertheless, it can be concluded that language actually determines thought. And that was the issue which somehow caught my attention. Well, a controversial issue. Anyway, in this respect, as I said, it gives a momentum to be presented in a somewhat different way. Now, well, that's, I would say, enough as far as that part of language is concerned. So let us concentrate on culture. Culture, on the other hand, requires a more detailed description, and it refers to a much wider scope of human activity and knowledge. And in this way, defining culture is a specific task, because among scholars there is no unanimity concerning the notion of this phenomenon, which is commonly identified with civilization. Culture, civilization, well, that's the simplest, let's say, presentation. Anyway, scholars often rely, and here comes a quote, they rely on a generic concept of culture as a collective name for language, religion, art, law, state, history, society, craft, etc. See, everything. It has to be underscored that the phenomenon of culture is multi-component and multi-constituent, and thus requires a panoramic view, which in turn results in numerous standpoints and thus definitions. Quite recently, culture also began to attract the attention of linguists, ethnographers, and foreign language educators who perceive the significance of implementation of cultural material into the foreign language curriculum. And that was the point I mentioned at the very beginning. What comes out of such observations is the prevailing opinion pointing to the language user's cultural experience as the key factor which makes one's linguistic competence complete. So, competence, what kind of competence? Linguistic, not enough. So linguistic plus cultural, we may say that in a sense, well, the language user's competence may be considered as complete. Well, from this view in turn comes out the notion of culture as, and another quote from Levine, culture as an inherited system of ideas that structure the subjective experience of individuals. End of quote. It means that culture has much to do with the shaping of individuals' identity. And again, it could be referenced to the Spaniard's presentation. So unity and diversity, which in many cases is a decisive factor responsible for quality of human contacts and thus communication. So the quoted by me, the author, Levine, underscores a substantial integrity of culture and communication. The same point of view is also represented by many scholars who rightly say that communication and culture are acquired simultaneously, and therefore they cannot exist separately. Hence, this opinion results in working out one more definition of culture. So, as I said, many definitions, many standpoints, according to which, and this is a quote, culture is a shared consensual way of life, and that sharing and consensus are made possible only through communication. See, again. More and more convincing and thus common becomes the opinion that it is impossible to acquire a new language completely and manifest its mastery without acquiring knowledge of social norms and cultural beliefs and values of the speakers of the language in question. This is so why? Why? Because, and another quote, meaning is embedded in cultural conceptions of context, and that, accordingly, the process of acquiring language is embedded in the process of acquiring culture. Voila. Again, strong integrity and interconnection between language and culture can be found in Karen Rasinger's point of view, a Danish scholar. And she says that, quote, human culture always includes language, and human language cannot be thought without culture. Linguistic practice is always embedded in and in interaction with some cultural, meaningful context. End of quote. Following the four quoted thoughts, opinions, or whatever, we come to a very adequate definition by Eleanor Ochs, whose observation on culture may be considered as the quintessence of the ongoing here discussion, my presentation. According to her, now, what she says is a quote, culture is a system of implicit and explicit ideas that underlines and gives meaning to behaviors in society. These ideas are related in various ways, to various extents, according to school or paradigm, to political, economic, religious, and kinship relations, events, interactions, and institutions, to values, to conceptions of the world, to theories of knowledge, and to procedures for understanding and interpreting. See? Now, without regard to drawbacks of any definition, as none of them may be perfect, a characteristic to be considered while discussing the phenomenon of culture is its social aspect. Since language is also a social construct, so language and culture interconnectedness must be a natural process, and the only instant of questioning and analysis is either the very process itself, again following von Humboldt's terminology, the process, energeia, or its output, ergon, created within a given period of time and at a given layer of human activity, such as, for example, political, economic, religious, interactional, education, just to mention a few. Although briefly presented, it seems, however, that the images of language and culture have been, I guess, adequately illustrated while building the image of the communication triangle. That's why, I wanted somehow to describe, explain, and define those component parts just to make us understand what I mean by those communication triangles. So now, the third and the final element of the triangle, that is expressiveness, has to be determined. The term expressiveness, as used for the purpose of my presentation and working out the idea of triangle, is understood as vivid, effective communication in speech or writing. It is also an explicit and comprehensive presentation of human mind's product, often full of emotions and feelings. So, expressiveness manifests the power of mind. Moreover, expressiveness, as mentioned earlier, has to be considered as the output resulting from the language-culture interconnection and interrelatedness. We can imagine that the procedure of interrelatedness, which involves and activates language and culture, is a sort of clash between these two components of the communication triangle. This sort of clash results in the final product, which appears in the form of language demonstrated by its user who represents a given cultural community. So it's quite natural that this community, like any other community, can be recognized by its political, economic, religious, educational, or behavioral views, beliefs or matters in general. Undoubtedly, views, beliefs, conceptions of the world, or theories of knowledge are prerequisites for the understanding and interpreting of the language in use. Moreover, they become essential to carry on a discourse and comply with the principles, both linguistic and cultural. Hence, it can be concluded that a high level of expressiveness testifies to the quality of communication in speech or writing, and therefore to the style and elegance of language. Evidently, expressiveness is the result of interconnection between language and culture. As a matter of fact, expressiveness is directly related to the presence and linguistic activity of a human being, the individual who simultaneously uses language and represents culture. Therefore, the language user, due to his linguistic performance, becomes the main linking element, joining the legs of the communication triangle. In consequence, the notion of the communication triangle emerges as a three-leg construct composed of tool, background, effect. Tool, well, grammar, well, language generally speaking. Background, culture. Effect, expressiveness. So, each of the three component parts are marked by the human presence, and each of them is made workable by a human being. From a variety of contemporary approaches to language and culture, one general conclusion may be drawn, namely, the unity of social life of a given social community is maintained by the community language, since language is regarded as a social product and communication device functioning within this community. So, well, I remember my discussion, for example, with Professor Bill Labov, whom I had the pleasure to meet years ago at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he says He considers language to be, and I remember, and I use this term, considers language as a social institution. So, moreover, language, from what we have already learned, appears to be a manifestation of culture, as all kinds of social activity are generalized by language. This is so because communication is inevitable in all cultures, and it involves all participants or consumers of culture, regardless of their social status or age. So when we know, well, it's a sort of truism, language does not develop in isolation, but the development of man is simultaneously the development of language and culture. Here, it is apparent that the process of language development, especially a foreign language, so that's again my reference to students and academics, um, should be viewed as regarded as actually intercultural education. So you can hardly consider the language user's knowledge as complete without achieving the fullest possible competence, including cultural. And this is the opinion which I find support to this opinion in newly rediscovered classics of Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, or just Wolf. So, well, I guess that so far the carried out discourse has been substantially free from confusion or doubt. However, at this point, a question arises. Just I put myself a question, namely, where does the interconnection between language and culture take place? Since we can take for granted that expressiveness is the result of the working of human mind, therefore expressiveness must take place just in the human mind. That is, in the mind of the individual who is involved in the process of communication, regardless of its form, spoken or written. Furthermore, we may ask one more question concerning the communicative repertoire put into service during a discourse by the language user. It appears that grammar, as you remember from the earlier stage of my presentation, is not sufficient to initiate discourse. Although, from the initial part of the presentation, we know that grammar is used to combine words, to form sentences, and finally enables the language user to be expressive. However, the question would be rather directed at the substance, which makes the triangle work and thus initiate communication. Hence, we would ask as follows. Another question or questions. What activates the triangle, or what makes expressiveness evident? What is responsible just for expressiveness? The answer seems to be simple, but we would never think about the core issue and correct answer unless we ask such questions. So this is just a philosophical approach. You don't have any answer if you don't ask a question. Can't be simpler, right? Hence, the insight of the communication triangle already created by us and by the language user and stored in his mind is filled with lexicon. Simple, but well, anyway, we have just to pay attention to what actually it is. So, lexicon, this is the knowledge of words. Hence, the use of lexicon makes expressiveness evident. An appropriate use of words activates the triangle and makes the language user expressive due to his ability to combine linguistic competence with cultural competence. Depending on the user's lexical repertoire, his creativity and expressiveness may reach either a high or low level of communication. Here again, we come across one more evidence of language and culture interconnection, since there must be a source for a list of words making up a lexicon. What is the source? And the answer can be found in another quote. So, quote, "This is just the language user's culture, which is a supply of names and notions, producing a lexicon. All these names and notions are the product of thoughts, and all of them are neatly ordered in accordance with the rules responsible for logical expressiveness in the language, being an instrument used within a given community for the purpose of communication." End of quote. In any discussion over expressiveness and its lexical source, it must be remembered that lexicon may appear in two forms, universal and individual. A universal lexicon in a sort of dictionary of the widest possible scope of linguistic applicability, while an individual lexicon is a repertory of names and notions stored in the language user's mind. Therefore, the universal form is homogeneous while the individual one is heterogeneous, which means that every single member of a social community, distinguished by its social cultural principles, possesses, as thus may demonstrate during communication, different names and notions, depending on what he stores in his individual repertoire. So, it is evident that the contents of the lexical repertoire testifies to the level of the individual's creativity and expressiveness, and thus it simultaneously provides evidence for the quality of his or her development and the level of language and culture. This is so because we have to remember that the language user's culture is responsible for producing a lexicon. This point of view finds support in Eleanor Ochs, who says, in the earlier part of the present discussion, I did quote, and let me remind you, she said that meaning is embedded in cultural conceptions. Therefore, if we consider two languages as immanent parts of two cultures, we have to take into account that meaning and distinctions encoded in one language only are unique to that language alone. This is the essence of linguistic relativity, once presented by Benjamin Lee Whorf as hypothesis, which nowadays is being rediscovered. This is a different approach to the hypothesis often criticized. Rediscovered especially if it comes to deal with some problems in translatability. So, moreover, linguistic relativity, marked with its idea of completely arbitrary compartments full of culturally determined meanings, gives a strong support to the status of language and culture interconnection. So now let me conclude just briefly. By all accounts, language elegance and expressiveness par excellence are the proofs of interconnectedness between language and culture. Furthermore, interconnection between language and culture, or even interdependence, makes us aware of a serious educational problem which teachers of foreign languages may face in their teaching practice. From the above presented discussion comes out that teaching a language is simultaneous with the teaching of the culture associated with this language. Well, we have already learned, just to remind you my previous quote, that human culture always includes language, and human language cannot be thought without culture. Therefore, the teaching learning process aimed at philology students who are close to me, especially foreign language students, should be focused on developing in them a sort of creative communicative competence, being a vivid illustration of how language and culture work together. And actually, it was the title of the blog I've been discussing. Not only students of philology, but also language users in general, such as for example, journalists, translators, politicians, have to be sensitive to interdependence and interconnection between language and culture, because the wrong selection of lexical items from their repertoire will result in an inability to understand them, or in their misunderstanding, which is even more dangerous. Even a more serious problem is language offensiveness. Deficits in cultural competence may cause that your neatly constructed utterances are grammatically correct, but your language output is offensive from the point of view of culture. So you may not be aware of that. Grammar, perfect. Effect, the result, horrible. So it is believed that the aim of the present discussion has been attained, and our attention directed at language and culture interconnectedness, perceived as a separate area to be dealt with in the teaching learning process designed for philologists. So instead of criticism, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has been viewed and revised here from a different perspective in order to make us sensitive to the effect that is the output of the language-culture interconnection and interrelatedness. So thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, actually, I have no words, Tomasz. I'm so much impressed, and the lecture was so thought-provoking that I have millions of questions. I will probably keep them for the future. And the floor is given to, well, actually, thank you very much. That was a kind of profound lecture with very many questions to go on thinking with.
Not only once we have time to discuss not only these things, but some others. So,
of course, anyway. We have time. Let me invite our conference participants to ask you some questions in case they have some. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Anna Leonardovna, any questions?
Yes, there is one question that we often discuss with Irina Pavlovna, and it is closely related to the idea of culture and language, and maybe some of our future topics for research. We have read some reports that after Brexit, English still has much support in the European Union. And many people for whom English is not native believe that now, after England has left the Union, they feel more confident to speak the language, and they believe that the new variant of English exists, Euro-English. Mm-hmm. And some of the European EU institutions like this idea because it supports the vision of the pan-European identity, EU identity, super-national identity. How do you think, is it something real? I mean, Euro-English and pan-European culture, is it like, do we have enough elements of this culture to call it a culture? Or it is just an illusion, or I don't know, a result of shared economy, shared, I don't know, political structures, or already a new type of pan-European cultures that was discussed after the Second World War and so on. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, it's a very interesting issue. Well, as you said, research could be a really vast research, but just coming to the point, we may say like this: the issue you raised, well, can split into two. The point of view represented by us, philologists, and we are somehow obsessed with perfection, and we try somehow to combine these two sorts of competence and implant them in our students, linguistic competence plus cultural competence. And the other one, you mentioned Euro-English. Well, in Europe is not that bad, I would say. Um, Generally speaking, the English version used among not only students but language users is more or less unified. Now, for example, if you talk to someone, if you talk to a Brit, you use your English and you make mistakes, you are never corrected because, well, it's quite natural. Now, sometimes, but occasionally it does happen that you are corrected, but never ever does it happen in America. And whatever you say is correct. See? Uh, the vast variety in America, really a vast variety of English. No, I'm not talking about dialects, which I teach with my students. We're talking about some dialects, American dialects, uh, uh, British English, and some varieties, English varieties, as spoken in Europe, Ireland, Scotland, England, or whatever. Anyway, this is the case. Look, we have to decide whether we view the problem from our point of view, perfectionists, obsessed, as I said, with the ability of joining the two sorts of competence, linguistic and cultural, and that's why, the cultural competence matters. In a minute, I'll give you an example. How we know a deficit at a very low level, at let's say the level of beginners, can be somehow frustrating. But in a minute, just let me finish the point of view. So this is one. Well, we have to decide whether we would somehow concentrate on offering and demanding from our students to use, let's say, correct English, right? Or we would demand them to be communicative. That's the way to somehow acknowledge that they can communicate, even with gestures.
Yeah, with this, yeah.
Yeah, even with gestures, they can communicate. But now, since I mentioned an example, look, now in the afternoon, I was just examining my students. They were coming into the room one by one in the afternoon. And I hear a knock, come in, and the student says, what? Good morning. See? Perfect? Perfect. Yes, but not, well, linguistically perfect, culturally wrong. And again, offensiveness. Of course, when I teach, language varieties, when I concentrate on language varieties, especially British and English variety, well, I'll talk about some, let's say, obscene terminology or words. Now, well, in Europe, in British English, we were trousers, right? And that's fine, you do trousers. But in American English, well, of course they understand trousers, but well, the word used is pants, which is underwear in British. So you have to be very careful whether you are talking to a Brit or to an American, right? Like this. So again, this is again a sort of cultural competence. Because, well, linguistically, both pants and trousers are correct. But culturally, well, it depends on the who you are talking to, Brit or American. So if I manage to answer your question, so fine. If I forgot about anything,
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Interesting how diverse English is and how many opportunities it gives for researchers, both linguistically and culturally.
Right. True. Absolutely true.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I have one more question. May I ask it? Tomasz, I was sitting and thinking during your lecture, I was sitting and thinking about really redefining superior verb hypothesis. And it has just occurred to me that we can possibly put the hypothesis, the redefined hypothesis, like this: cultural determinism or cultural relativity. Not linguistic relativity, but cultural relativity. We can do
True.
it.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
Exactly. And, I was sitting and listening to you, and I was writing down some words in Polish. The words like buleczka,
Mhm.
stokrotka,
Mhm.
sałatka, śmietanka, biedronka, galaretka. These are the words that I usually come across while shopping, for example, in Poland. And every time I read them, I think, what a beautiful language. What a beautiful nation speaking this
Based on
language.
diminutives.
Yes, can you
Yes.
feel this beauty of the Polish language in those suffixes, minimizing suffixes, diminishing suffixes? Because for us, the speakers of Ukrainian, this is a very culturally determined and culturally relative thing. Do you feel this beauty of the Polish language, or you are just doing this mechanically?
Well, uh, I guess that's, again, that's culture, and I would say not culture, but nature, just to use diminutives. Um, Diminutives in English often are used in the case of names, first names.
Right.
John, Johnny, Jack, right? Maggie, etc. Now, uh, in Polish, of course, we use diminutives in the case of names, first names, but well, um, there's I would say what it's something natural. It's a natural. Well, I would even say use the word behavior. Um, is passed on any other objects, any other names, as well, those you mentioned, bułeczka or whatever. Uh,
In
so,
Ukrainian, we have bulka, we have mandarina, and in Polish, there is mandarinki. So every time I read mandarinki, my soul starts blooming. That's a very special thing.
well, true, you are absolutely right when once you mentioned that the hypothesis now being rediscovered can be expanded by
Mhm.
that the third leg, not well, the cultural, let's say, aspect, the culture, absolutely, this is the nature, this is the mentality. And well, I didn't want to take time in the morning during the presentation of the professor from Spain, but actually the Western Europe doesn't understand certain our mentality, Slavic mentality. I wouldn't say Polish or Ukrainian, Slavic. One more example from the States. Um, I was staying with one university and I was invited by a neighboring university to give an open lecture. And well, the American tradition is that once you are invited, you are given a sort of a counterpart, someone who takes care of you. And I was cared by a beautiful young lady, young professor of Slovak origin, Slovak American. Now, of course, the meeting was in English. I gave the lecture in English, and officially we were talking in English. And after the lecture, we wanted to continue just in private, just a party or something like this with her students. So we were on the way from the university building to a students' on faculty club, going through a park. While going through the park, she said, "Well, look, I don't have a chance to use my Slovak, so perhaps we'll talk in. I use the Slovak, yeah, and you will understand." Okay, so and she started speaking Slovak. she was speaking in Slovak and I was answering in Polish. Now, her students were marching behind us, just a few paces behind. Once they were talking, talkative, and suddenly they remained speechless, silent. And one of them couldn't stand the silence, approached us and said, "Excuse me, professor, never ever did you tell us that you know Polish." And then I said, "Okay, my dear." She's speaking Slovak and I am speaking. Oh, yeah, we would never expect that these two languages are so close. Languages, cultures, or whatever. Well, so this is again, closeness, linguistic closeness, cultural closeness, and which is not understood by the Western communities. Unfortunately, they somehow perceived us, either, they speak one language, or perhaps they speak dialects. Perhaps this is one language with a variety of dialects. So, the mentality is different. That's why, there are some problems. Again, I am coming back to the opening lecture. Some problems with the European Union because, the guidance by Germany or France is really, this is just a horrible experience. Well, to what countries? The Visegrad bloc, Czech Republic, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, which is somehow traditionally related to Poland, to our culture. We had many common, we shared kings in the past. That's why, although we never ever spoke in Poland, Hungarian wasn't spoken, while in Hungary, Polish is quite popular, I would say. Anyway, just this is marginal. This is my marginal remark, pointing to what can be done in the area, in the sphere, as Irina mentioned, in the sphere of culture. There's research studies and somehow to expand the ideas hidden in the hypothesis. As I said, they are rediscovered. There are many publications nowadays, just publications based on the rediscovery of Wittgenstein, Vygotsky, and Wolf. Okay, so that's it. Too long.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Is there